The Australian election is finally over. Actually, it's been over for quite some time, but it's only now that the Australian Electoral Commission has released the final data. So, since they have, it's time to do a deep dive into some of the more interesting aspects of the results. The most noteworthy part of the 47th Parliament is, of course, the size of the crossbench. 16 MPs who aren't sitting with either of the major parties. This is the largest crossbench in the lower house ever. The record previously was 6. There are 2 main players on the crossbench: the Greens, who won 4 seats, and Climate 200, who provided some of the financial backing for the campaigns of a further 10. Climate 200 backed 20 candidates in the lower house. 4 of them were already sitting MPs. That's Rebecca Sharkey of the Centre Alliance, and the Independents Andrew Wilkie, Helen Haines, and Zali Steggall. So that leaves 16 fresh candidates, or 15 and Alex Dyson, who had run before. Now, before the election, I made a prediction that in order to win, those candidates would need to do 2 things. First, get more votes than Labour, and second, reduce the incumbent MP's first preferences to 45% or below. So, was I right? Well, yes. All 6 of the Climate 200 independents who were successful managed to do exactly that, with the highest Liberal vote in those electorates going to Josh Frydenberg, with a primary of 42.66. However, there were also 3 independents who fulfilled my somewhat arbitrary criteria who weren't elected. Kaz Heisey in Cowper and Alex Dyson in Wannon for Climate 200, and Rob Priestley in Nichols. The difference is that those 3 seats are all rural seats, whereas the ones the Climate 200 candidates were successful in were metropolitan. This is not to say that an independent can't be successful in a rural seat, of course, but that the criteria for winning there is different. All 3 seats had much higher votes for right-wing minor parties, for example, the UAP, One Nation, and the Lib Dems, who, in general, preferenced more strongly towards the coalition than the independent. There were also 2 electorates where the Climate 200 candidate was half successful, Nicolette Burler in Bradfield and Kate Hook in Killare. Both candidates did better than Labour, but didn't drop the incumbent MP below 45%, and so didn't win the seat. They were both very close, however, and should they choose to run again, they might very well win. And finally, there were 3 seats where the Climate 200 candidates did fairly well, but were still excluded before Labour. That's Gray, Hughes, and Page. Now this is interesting. In general, people who voted independent had a reasonable preference for Labour over the Liberals, but people who voted Labour strongly preferenced the independent over the Liberals. If Hannah-Beth Luke in Page, Georgia Steele in Hughes, or Liz Haberman in Gray had done just slightly better than Labour during the distribution of preferences, well, they still wouldn't have won, but they would have come much closer than the Labour candidate was able to. It's also worth mentioning that while all of the new Climate 200 independents ran against incumbent coalition MPs, one of those seats did end up voting Labour, Boothby in South Australia. Now, another piece of information the AEC releases is the 2-party preferred results between the coalition and Labour for each seat, even when they aren't the final 2 candidates. So we can see what the results would have been if Australia only had a 2-party system. This election, the crossbench was fairly evenly split. 7 of those seats would have gone to Labour and 9 to the coalition. This would have given 84 seats to Labour and 67 to the coalition, which is a very similar result to Labour's win in 2007. Having the 2-party preferred vote for the crossbench also gives us some insight into how many Liberals voted for the independents. Let's have a look at Zali Steggall's election win in 2019 as an example. First, we look at the full distribution of preferences for Warringah. After the 8th count, only 3 candidates are left: Labour, the Liberals, and Zali Steggall. At this point, Tony Abbott had received 41% of the vote. Now, we look at the 2-party preferred result, which is only between Labour and the Liberals. On this count, Tony Abbott received 52% of the vote. By moving between these 2 counts, it shows us what would have happened if Zali Steggall had been eliminated, even though at this point she had more votes than Labour. And the amount of votes that move from Zali Steggall to Tony Abbott are the amount of people who put the independents before Liberals and the Liberals before Labour. This gives us about 10% of the voters, or almost 1 in 5 votes for Zali Steggall, who would rather have a Liberal MP than a Labour one. Without this group, Zali Steggall would not have won Warringah in 2019. And that's why, during this year's election, none of the independents ruled out working with the coalition. So these numbers are what each independent received on the 2-candidate preferred count, and this is how many of those votes would have then flowed back to the Liberal Party if the independent had been eliminated. Without the independents, all of these would still be Liberal seats. With that in mind, all of these seats did see swings against the Liberals versus Labour, so the possibility is there that they might eventually elect a Labour or even a Green MP. But at this point, they're all more blue than red. Interestingly, this is the first election where Rebecca Sharkey's seat of Mayo would have been won by Labour rather than the Liberals on a 2-party preferred basis. Okay, let's move on to the other independents who weren't backed by Climate 200. Of those 78 candidates, only 6 of them received above 10% of the primary vote, and only one of those was elected, Dai Lee in Fowler. Dai Lee was primarily running against a Labour rather than a coalition candidate, and achieved the inverse of my criteria, receiving a higher primary vote than the Liberals and reducing the Labour primary to below 45%. Of the other 5, all of them were running in coalition seats, and 4 of those were only just behind Labour during preference allocation. The numbers you see here are their first preference votes, and then these are how many votes they had when they were eliminated. Given the way preferences flowed from the independents to the 2 major parties, it's possible that Hinkler, Hume, and Malley are still open to being won by an independent in the future, if they can manage to overtake Labour. And Monash could be won by either an independent or by the Labour Party. The weirdest result was the seat of Groom in Queensland. Susie Holt was one of 2 independent candidates running, and she placed 4th with only 8.26% of the vote. But as the other candidates were eliminated, more and more preferences flowed to her, until she eventually surpassed Labour and came 2nd with 43%, well above Labour on the 2-party preferred result. Putting all of this into context, in 2019, there were only 11 independents who received more than 10% of the vote, and all of them, except Andrew Wilkie, were running in majority coalition seats. The coalition lost 2 of those races and came close to losing 2 more. This election, there were 23 independents who received above 10% of the vote, and 21 of them were running in coalition seats. The coalition lost 8 of those races, and were within 10% of losing another 12. It will be interesting to see whether the independent movement gains steam from its recent success, or if this is as far as they can reasonably go. Now, on to the Greens. 2022 was the biggest election win for the Greens so far, with 4 seats in the lower house and 12 in the Senate. The amount of seats where the Greens' primary vote was above 20% also increased from 12 to 17, and they saw an overall gain in the primary vote, with a national swing of 1.85%. Now, this doesn't sound like a lot, but bear in mind the 2 major parties both had swings against them. So the Greens had a good night. However, there are a few interesting takeaways. First, while 2 of the seats the Greens won came from the Liberal Party, all 4 of their seats would have voted Labour on the 2-party preferred vote. So the common criticism that the Greens only take seats away from Labour is still technically true. Additionally, the Greens were only able to pick up 3 new seats because Labour placed 3rd on the 3-candidate preferred count. Now, the 3-candidate preferred count is not a thing. In order to get it, you again need to find the full distribution of preferences on the AEC website and scroll down to the second last count, where the only candidates remaining are the Coalition, Labour, and the Greens. If at this point the 3 parties have roughly the same amount of votes, then it's vitally important which party comes 3rd. If the Greens or Coalition come 3rd, then the seat will be won by Labour. However, if Labour comes 3rd, which is what happened in Brisbane, Griffith, and Ryan, then the seat will be won by the Greens. This has to do again with the distribution of preferences. If we look at all of the times Labour has been eliminated, 80% of their preferences have flowed to the Greens. This mirrors the support Greens voters give to Labour, with around 80% of preferences from the Greens flowing back. But in a contest between Labour and the Greens, what happens to the Liberal vote? Well, up until 2013, the Liberal Party used to put Labour last on their how to vote cards, which resulted in 75% of their preferences flowing to the Greens in a Labour-Green competition. This is how Adam Bandt won the seat of Melbourne in 2010. If the Liberals had preferenced Labour first, he wouldn't have been elected. Of course, after Adam Bandt's win, the Liberal Party changed tack, and now they put the Greens last on their how to vote cards. So Liberals' preferences are now more likely to flow to Labour. Having said that, around a third of Liberal preferences still go to the Greens. So the Greens can win in a competition against Labour as long as they have a big enough lead, as Adam Bandt now does in Melbourne. Looking at the 3-candidate preferred count also gives us a better idea of what the real margins are. According to the Electoral Commission, Griffith is a safe Greens seat, with Max Chandler Mather having a margin of more than 10%. But if you look at the 3-candidate result, you can see that there's actually less than 5,000 votes between Labour and the Liberals. If you think of the margin as the amount of votes that needs to be changed in order to produce a different outcome, then a swing of only 2% from the Liberal Party to Labour would result in Griffith changing to a Labour seat. This works against Labour as well. There are 3 safe Labour seats, which are actually only fairly safe from the Greens, and 2 seats, Macnamara and Richmond, which are amongst the most marginal seats in the country. Interestingly, if the Liberal Party had decided not to run a candidate in Ryan, Griffith or Brisbane, the Greens would not have won those seats. In a 2-party race between Labour and the Greens, Labour would have won. The chances of the Liberals deciding not to do this in the future, of course, is fairly small. The last noteworthy point is the different fortunes enjoyed by the Liberal and National parties. The coalition had a bad night overall, losing 19 seats to Labour, the Greens and the Independents. However, none of those seats were held by the Nationals. In fact, the Nationals haven't lost a single seat since 2007. The Nationals are a hard party to quantify. According to the AEC, on election night they only received 3.6% of the vote, placing them behind the Greens, Independents, One Nation and the United Australia Party. But this doesn't tell the whole story. The Nationals only ran in 22 seats this election, down 8 from 2019. Of those, they won 16, 10 under the Nationals branding and 6 under the LNP in Queensland. 11 of those seats they won are also considered safe seats, including 2 of the safest seats in the country, and a further 3 are not at risk from Labour, but from an independent. Only the National seat of Flynn is considered marginal to Labour, with a 2-party preferred result of 53%. We can also break down the Queensland votes based on which party room the candidate would sit in. The LNP received just over 1 million votes in Queensland, and just under a quarter of those were for Nationals candidates. This pushes the Nationals' national vote share up to 5.47%, above the Independents, One Nation and the UAP, but still less than half than that of the Greens. Using the same metric in 2019, they received 6.41% of the vote, so they did see a swing against them. Half of that can be attributed to running fewer candidates than in 2019, but the rest not so much. Of course, you can also look at this data another way. The Nationals only ran in 22 seats. Out of the 2 million formal votes cast in those seats, they received 800,000, or just over 36%. This is up from 2019, where the numbers were 30 seats, 2.8 million votes, 900,000 for the Nationals, for a share of 32%. So the election night story of the Nationals seems to be consolidation. They aren't expanding, but they aren't shrinking either. And finally, if you're elected and you have a beard, you're much more likely to be left-wing than right-wing. Only 3 Liberal parliamentarians have beards, and the Nationals apparently can't or won't grow them.